I always thought that what we say in the dark dies in silence, but I was wrong. The second my heart stopped, I discovered that every lie and every poison that left my mouth was waiting for me on the other side, materialized as blades ready for the reckoning. The court of dead words does not forgive. It only weighs what you tried to hide. The air didn't come out. That was the first thing I noticed. Oxygen entered my lungs but fed nothing. As if my blood had suddenly turned to coarse sand. I looked at the monitor beside the hospital bed and saw that green line, straight and cold, accompanied by a continuous beep that seemed to pierce my skull. I wanted to scream to the nurse that I was still there, that I could still see the coffee stain on her coat, but my mouth refused to open. It was then that the room's ceiling simply dissolved. Not like a demolition, but like smoke blown by the wind, revealing a rust-colored sky, heavy, that seemed to be inches from my face. I felt a violent tug in my stomach, as if a fishhook had snagged my soul and I was dragged down. The linoleum floor disappeared and I fell. It wasn't a fast fall. It was slow, suffocating, through a mass of soot and static. As I descended, I began to hear, not thunder. It was my own words, thousands of them. Phrases I said laughing at bar tables, lies I told to climb the corporate ladder, the poison I distilled against those who loved me. They were no longer sounds. They were solid, sharp objects, striking against my body in the fall. Cutting my spiritual skin like heated razors, I was entering the court of dead words. And for the first time in decades, I no longer had a way to lie to myself. My feet hit the ground with an impact that didn't break bones but shattered my dignity. The ground wasn't earth or stone. It was a metallic surface, oily and infinitely cold, reflecting a sickly light coming from nowhere. Around me, the megacity of the abyss rose like a nightmare of impossible architecture, with raw concrete buildings that seemed to bleed soot under that ember-colored sky. There was no wind, but the air smelled of burnt electricity and sulfur, an odor that stuck in the throat and prevented any attempt at prayer. I started walking because standing still meant feeling the ground suck the rest of the heat. I still imagined I had. That was when I noticed the crowd. Thousands of gray figures wandered the wide avenues, all with hands covering their mouths, eyes wide in a mute panic that never found relief. I tried to touch the shoulder of a man passing by me, but my hand went through the worn fabric of his clothing, as if he were made of dense smoke. He turned around, and for a second I saw the void where his tongue should have been. He tried to form a word, but only a static hiss escaped, a sound resembling a car radio tuned between stations. Terror hit me like an electric shock as I understood the rule of that place. Their silence was not peace. It was an eternal gag imposed by the justice I always ignored. I was alive, or what remained of me was. But I was an island of agony in an ocean of people who could no longer find solace. Every step I took echoed like a hammer on an anvil, announcing my arrival to the place where time is not counted in hours, but in weights. I was pushed by an invisible force toward an immense atrium that opened between the concrete towers. The ceiling was so high it was lost in the ash mist, but the walls were covered in iron hooks that descended to my eye level. Hanging on them, swaying slightly, were carcasses of something that looked like flesh, but vibrated with a malignant energy. When I got closer, horror paralyzed me. Those things weren't flesh, they were phrases. They were my phrases. I recognized the texture of a lie I told my mother on her deathbed. Something about everything being okay when I was already planning to sell the house. It glowed with a greenish shade of rot and pulsed like a sick heart. A guttural sound, like an animal being sacrificed, began to come out of the walls, and I realized it was my own voice recorded in eternity. I was forced to touch that physical manifestation of my cruelty. Upon touching the phrase with my fingers, the pain was instant. I felt as if 1,000 ice needles entered through my fingernails and raced to the center of my chest. I couldn't look away. It was a banquet of horrors where I was the only guest in the main course. Every slander I cast against co-workers was there, exposed like a trophy of infamy. The court had no judge seated on a throne because The very existence of those words was the sentence. I created them, I fed them with my pride, and now they demanded due attention. I felt I would have to digest each one of them, one by one, tasting the flavor of metal and bile that I myself distilled in life. Eternity, there wasn't a straight line. It was a closed circle around every mistake I made, thinking no one was listening. A spiritual nausea doubled me over when I was forced to relive the darkest day of my inventory. I saw, projected in the shadows of the walls, the face of a young apprentice who worked with me years ago. I remembered the cold satisfaction I felt when using my influence to plant a cruel doubt about his integrity, just because he shone brighter than I did. In the court, the perspective changed. I was no longer the observer, I was him. I felt the weight of the world collapsing onto that boy's shoulders. The confusion, the muffled crying in the bathroom, and the slow destruction of his hope. Every word of mine was like a sledgehammer blow to his joints, and I felt every impact on my own nervous system. His agony became my skin. I realized that hell is the detailed anatomy of the damage we cause. Without the anesthesia of the ego to protect us, I saw the consequences of my sentences branching out like veins of a poison that never stopped spreading, reaching people I didn't even know, all because I chose to be vile out of vanity. The rhythm of my suffering gave no truce. It was a ceaseless repetition of that moment of betrayal, where I tasted my own contempt as if I were swallowing shards of glass. Regret, there is a knife that cuts but doesn't kill. It only exposes the wound so it bleeds once more. I understood that my tongue had been a factory of invisible deaths, and now I was being forced to live in each of the graves I had dug. I was dragged to a final chamber where time seemed to have solidified into layers of black ice. There were no more images or shapes, only absolute silence that weighed like a mountain on the back of my neck. In front of me floated the number 351, written in a pale, agonizing light. They were my last days on earth, the exact period when mercy prowled around me like a whisper, and I shooed it away with my foot. I saw every opportunity to ask for forgiveness pass before me like a train. I deliberately let leave. Every time the lump in my throat asked me to be humble, and I preferred the posture of pride. The weight of those days transformed into a physical density, an atmospheric pressure that began to crush my existence until I became nothing but a point of pure pain. There was no verdict shouted by angels or demons, only the door of my own conscience closing from the inside, locking me in the void I myself cultivated. I understood in the last atom of lucidity that God did not cast me out. I was the one who spent every syllable of my life building a wall between us, and now the wall was too high to jump. I was left there, in the court of dead words, where the only company is the echo of my last lie, repeating itself forever in the vacuum. If you still breathe and taste the saliva in your mouth, understand, your words do not die in the air. They pave the path to where you're going right now.